The barbed wire of Auschwitz was meant to be unbreakable. The watchtowers, the dogs, the endless roll calls, every detail was designed to crush the last flicker of hope. And yet, in the shadow of smoke rising from the crematoria, a boy refused to die. He was just a child, marked for extermination. But through courage, cunning, and the sheer will to live, he found a way to slip past the machinery of death. His journey did not end with liberation. Against all odds, he survived the darkest chapter in human history, and later he rose to stand in a courtroom, not as a victim but as a judge, a man dedicated to justice in a world that had once denied him even the right to exist. This is his story. Stay with us until the end, and subscribe now to ensure these voices are never silenced again. Before the trains, before the hunger, before the smell of burning flesh that would one day cling to his memories, there was simply childhood. He was born in a small town in Eastern Europe, in a home filled with the sounds of laughter, Yiddish lullabies, and the steady rhythm of his father's hammer at the workbench. His mother's hands smelled of bread dough and soap. His sister braided his hair when he was very young, and his brother taught him how to skip stones across the river. Life was ordinary, even beautiful, until it wasn't. The first cracks appeared in whispers, neighbors avoiding eye contact, teachers hesitating before calling his name in class, a curfew here, a restriction there. The boy was too young to understand politics, but he felt the shift in the air like a storm rolling in. His parents tried to shield him, but they couldn't hide the yellow star stitched onto his coat, or the fear in their voices when German boots echoed through the cobblestone streets. By 1941, everything had changed. The family was forced into a ghetto, crammed into a single room with other families. Hunger gnawed constantly, and disease spread faster than prayers could contain it. Still, children found ways to play among the rubble, their laughter thin but defiant. The boy clung to those fleeting moments, knowing instinctively that they might not last. One night, he awoke to shouts. German soldiers stormed into the ghetto, rifles raised, barking orders in a language that seemed made of stone. Families were dragged from their beds, herded into the square like cattle. His mother's arms tightened around him, her fingers trembling against his cheek. His father whispered something, words that the boy would carry for the rest of his life. No matter what they do, you must live. The deportations began. People vanished overnight. Sometimes they returned in wooden carts, their bodies covered with sheets. More often, they simply never came back. Rumors circulated of camps, of factories where people were worked to death, of places where smoke rose but no chimneys stood. Adults spoke in hushed voices, while children tried to understand why entire families disappeared in the span of a heartbeat. Then it was his family's turn. At dawn, soldiers marched them to the train station. The boy clutched his mother's hand as tightly as he could. The platform was chaos, dogs barking, babies screaming, soldiers shouting. The train loomed before them, its doors already open, waiting like the mouth of a beast. Inside, the stench of sweat, fear, and despair hit them immediately. The cattle car was so crowded they could barely breathe. There was no light, no water, no air. Only the sound of people praying, crying, or collapsing onto the wooden floor. For 2 days, the train rattled through the countryside. He tried to look through the cracks in the planks, catching glimpses of fields, villages, rivers, normal life passing by, oblivious to the suffering trapped inside. Hunger burned in his stomach, but it was thirst that tormented them most. When the train finally screeched to a halt, the boy thought he might die before the doors opened, but they did open, and what awaited him outside would end childhood forever. Blinding lights, barking orders, men in striped uniforms running to and fro, herding people into lines. A sign over the gate, Arbeit macht frei. He couldn't read it, but he saw the way his father's face turned ashen, his mother's lips tightened. He didn't know the word yet, but he had arrived at Auschwitz, and what happened in those first hours on the ramp would determine who lived, who died, and who might dare to escape. The doors of the cattle car slammed open with a metallic shriek that seemed to cut through the dawn. The boy blinked against the sudden light, his legs stiff and trembling from 2 days without movement. Outside, a sea of uniforms and rifles waited. Dogs strained at leashes, their growls echoing against the walls of the station. Orders were barked in German, incomprehensible but terrifying all the same. They were herded out in waves, stumbling down from the train onto the ramp. The ground beneath their feet was damp with frost, though the boy barely felt the cold. He was too busy clinging to his mother's skirt, his eyes darting from soldier to soldier, sensing danger without understanding its full shape. The family shuffled forward in a line that branched into two. At the center stood a tall man in a crisp uniform, his hand moving lazily, almost casually, as though swatting flies. Left, right. It was a sorting process, but the boy did not know it meant life or death. When they reached the officer, his father straightened his back, trying to look strong, useful. The man's eyes flicked across them, father, mother, children. His finger pointed sharply. The father was sent to one side, the boy and his mother to the other. His brother and sister were swallowed into the crowd, their cries muffled by barking dogs. It happened so fast. One moment they were together, the next his family was torn apart. He turned, desperate to follow his father. But his mother's grip was iron. She pulled him close, whispering, "Stay with me." No matter what, they were marched past the looming gates, past prisoners in striped uniforms who moved with hollow eyes, carrying bodies, hauling carts, sweeping ash from the ground as though it were dust. The boy smelled something acrid in the air, thick and sweet like burning wood, but wrong. He did not yet know it was the scent of human flesh rising from the crematoria. Inside the camp, they were stripped of everything. Clothes, possessions, names. They became numbers tattooed on forearms, ink pressed so deep it felt like fire. The boy stared at the figures etched into his mother's skin, not fully realizing they were branding her like cattle. Days blurred into one another. Roll calls at dawn lasted for hours, prisoners forced to stand in the freezing cold until their legs gave out. Those who collapsed were beaten, sometimes shot, while the rest watched in silence. Hunger gnawed at them constantly. A crust of bread, a ladle of watery soup. This was survival, if it could be called that. The boy learned quickly. Do not speak unless spoken to. Do not look the guards in the eyes. Move when told, run when ordered, hide your weakness at all costs. He watched others, grown men, fall to the ground and never rise again. He was only a child, but already he knew that innocence had no place here. At night in the barracks, whispers spread. Some said the chimneys burned day and night because they were not factories, but furnaces. Others swore there were experiments, doctors choosing who lived and who died with a single glance. The boy listened, his heart pounding, unable to decide if it was worse to believe or to hope they were lies. Yet in this place of despair, he also found fragments of humanity. An older prisoner slipped him extra crumbs. Another taught him how to make himself invisible during inspections. Even in Auschwitz, kindness flickered like a candle against the wind, but every candle could be snuffed out. One evening, as the boy clutched his mother's hand during roll call, a guard's eyes fixed on them. He raised his rifle, barking an order. The mother froze, her grip tightening. The boy felt his chest tighten with terror. Something was about to happen, something that would shatter the last fragile thread of security he had left. The guard's rifle hovered like a sentence not yet delivered. For a moment, the boy thought it was the end, here on the cold gravel of Auschwitz. But another officer shouted something from across the yard, drawing the guard's attention. The rifle lowered. The moment passed. Yet in that instant, the boy realized how fragile life had become. One twitch of a finger could erase him. From then on, he lived as if hunted. The barracks were crowded with shadows, men and women who looked more like skeletons than people. Their eyes were sunken, their skin grey. Some whispered prayers, others sat in silence, staring at nothing. To the boy, they seemed less like the living and more like ghosts forced to walk among the condemned. Each day began with the roll call, hours of standing motionless in the bitter cold. Children were few, and most were hidden or disguised to look older. His mother worked tirelessly to keep him from being noticed. She dirtied his face to hide the softness of his cheeks, pressed him to stand straight, to move quickly when ordered. "They must not see you as weak," she whispered. The boy learned the routines. He carried stones from one side of the camp to the other, only to move them back again. It was labor without purpose, designed to break the spirit. Hunger hollowed him out, but he never complained. He saved crumbs in a rag, rationing them carefully, sometimes sharing with his mother when her hands trembled too much to work. At night, he listened to the sounds of the camp, the cries of those beaten, the rumble of trucks carrying away new arrivals, the hiss of the crematoria chimneys that never stopped. He asked once what burned inside them, but his mother hushed him quickly, her eyes filling with tears she tried to hide. Whispers of escape passed through the barracks like contraband. A man claimed he knew a way through the wire. Another swore he had bribed a guard. Most who tried vanished, never seen again. Their absence spoke louder than words. Yet the boy listened closely, filing away details, though he was too small, too powerless to act, at least for now. One day, while hauling stones, he saw a group of prisoners collapse. The guards didn't hesitate. Shots rang out, bodies dropped into the mud, and the work continued as if nothing had happened. The boy froze, his heart hammering, until another prisoner shoved him forward. "Keep moving," the man hissed. "Don't stop, no matter what." It was in moments like this that the boy understood Auschwitz was more than a camp. It was a machine. Every guard, every fence, every order was part of a vast engine designed to erase people. And yet, against that machine, there was still resistance, the quiet act of saving a crust of bread, the whisper of a prayer, the stubborn act of surviving one more day. Weeks blurred into months. Time had no meaning. His father remained somewhere in the camp, but they never crossed paths. His siblings had vanished, their fates unknown. The boy carried them in his memory, replaying their laughter, their voices, as if to keep them alive. But he could not hold on to childhood. He had become a survivor, thinking like a soldier, watching every move, learning how to disappear when danger approached. And it was this transformation that prepared him for what came next, because in Auschwitz, the only way to live was to risk everything. And soon, the boy would be faced with a choice so dangerous, so unthinkable, that even the ghosts around him seemed to whisper, "You cannot survive this." The idea of escape in Auschwitz was almost laughable. The fences were electrified, the watchtowers armed, the dogs trained to tear apart flesh. Guards patrolled with rifles and orders to shoot at the slightest movement. The camp was designed not just to imprison, but to annihilate hope. And yet for the boy, escape began as a whisper, an ember he dared not let burn too brightly. It started with observation. He noticed where the guards' eyes lingered, where their patrols overlapped, where shadows fell on the perimeter fence at certain hours of the night. He listened to prisoners who had worked outside the camp, memorizing their stories of ditches, fields, and forests beyond the wire. He said nothing, asked no questions. Children who asked too much did not last long. But inside, he built a map, a fragile blueprint of possibility. One night his mother fell ill. Fever consumed her, leaving her too weak to stand at roll call. He tried to rouse her, shaking her shoulders, but she pushed him away with a trembling hand. "You must go," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Don't stay, live." Her eyes burned into his, the same eyes that had shielded him from the horrors of this place. In that moment he understood. Survival might mean leaving her behind. It tore at him, but the boy's will to live sharpened. If he stayed, he would die with her. If he left, perhaps her sacrifice would not be in vain. That night he made his choice. He would attempt what seemed impossible. The opportunity came on a work detail. Selected to carry supplies beyond the main gate, he marched with others under guard. The road stretched ahead, lined with ditches and the occasional cluster of trees. His heart hammered so loudly, he was sure the guards would hear it. He waited, watching, calculating. Then it happened. A distraction, an argument between two guards, one raising his voice, the other gesturing wildly. The boy saw his chance. He slipped sideways into the ditch, crawling low, pressing his body against the frozen earth. Each second stretched into eternity. His breath caught in his throat as boots crunched nearby. The bark of a dog shattered the silence. He froze, mud caking his face, praying to become invisible. The guard cursed, yanking the dog's leash, pulling it away. The boy inched forward, sliding like a shadow toward the trees. When he reached the cover of branches, he ran. He didn't look back, not once. He ran until his legs threatened to give out, until the air sliced his lungs like knives. The camp fell away behind him, swallowed by darkness. But freedom was not what he imagined. Outside the camp was not safety. It was wilderness, villages filled with danger, patrols scouring the land for runaways. If caught, his death would be slow and public, a warning to others. He hid by day, crawling into haystacks, burrowing into ditches, drinking from muddy streams. By night he moved cautiously, guided by stars he barely recognized. Hunger gnawed, thirst consumed, fear wrapped itself around him like a second skin. Days blurred together. His body weakened, but his mind clung to one thought. Every step carried him further from Auschwitz. Every heartbeat defied the men who had built that place. Then, one night, as he stumbled through a thicket, he heard voices. Foreign, not German. His heart leapt and sank in the same instant. Voices meant danger, but they also meant possibility. He crouched, listening. The words were in Polish. Farmers, perhaps. People who might help or betray. The boy's decision was agonizing. Reveal himself and risk capture, or stay hidden and starve. He inched closer, trembling, until a branch snapped under his foot. Silence fell. The voices stopped, and then a lantern beam swept across the dark, landing directly on his face. The lantern froze him where he stood. His body screamed to run, but his legs refused. Two men emerged from the darkness, their faces hard, weathered by farm work and fear. They spoke quickly in Polish, words he could barely follow. One pointed at him, the other muttered something about runaway and Jews. The boy's heart pounded so hard he thought it might burst. But then one of the men stepped closer. He lowered the lantern, his eyes scanning the child's ragged clothes, the haunted look etched into his young face. Whatever he saw was enough. He whispered something to the other man, then motioned for the boy to follow. They led him to a barn on the edge of a village. Inside, the smell of hay and animals wrapped around him, earthy and warm compared to the sterile stench of Auschwitz. The men gave him bread, real bread, thick and heavy, not the dry crusts he'd known in the camp. He devoured it in seconds, tears streaming down his cheeks as he chewed. For the first time in months he tasted life, but safety came at a price. The men warned him. If the Germans discovered they were hiding him, their entire families could be executed. The boy understood. He became silent, invisible, tucked away in the loft, moving only when told. Days stretched into weeks. Sometimes he heard German patrols outside, boots crunching on the road, dogs barking as they searched. Each time he pressed himself deeper into the hay, scarcely daring to breathe. Loneliness was its own torment. He thought of his mother, of her last words urging him to live. He thought of his father, his siblings, their faces fading in memory even as he tried desperately to hold on to them. Survival felt like betrayal. Why him? Why had he escaped while others remained behind the barbed wire? These questions became as heavy as hunger, gnawing at him with no answer. Yet even in hiding, he learned. The farmers whispered news of the war, the Red Army pushing west, the Allies landing in France, the Reich beginning to fracture. Each rumor was a thread of hope, binding him to the idea that liberation might be real. He clung to it as tightly as he had once clung to his mother's hand. Then one bitter night, the barn door crashed open. German soldiers stormed inside, their flashlights slicing through the dark. The boy's heart seized. Had someone betrayed him? He buried himself in the hay, praying it would conceal him. The soldiers shouted, overturned barrels, stabbed their bayonets into piles of straw. One thrust landed inches from his face. He bit his lip to keep from crying out. Minutes felt like hours. Finally the soldiers cursed, convinced the barn was empty. They slammed the door behind them, their boots fading into the night. The boy exhaled, trembling so violently the hay rustled around him. That night he understood the full cost of survival. To live was to endure terror again and again, never knowing which moment might be the last. Months later, the war began to turn. German patrols grew fewer, their shouts less confident. The farmers whispered that the Soviets were coming. Liberation was near. But liberation was not the end. For the boy, it would mean facing the ruins of his family, the weight of memory, and the unbearable question of what to do with a life stolen back from death. As the front lines crept closer, he lay awake in the loft, clutching the memory of Auschwitz, the faces of those he had lost. Freedom was near, but so was the reckoning, and soon the boy who had defied Auschwitz would step into a world unprepared for his survival. When the Red Army finally reached the region, the boy emerged from hiding not into triumph, but into ruin. The villages were scarred, homes burned, fields abandoned. German troops had fled, leaving behind only the echoes of their cruelty. Liberation did not bring joy. It brought silence. Silence heavy with the knowledge that entire families, entire communities had vanished. The farmers who had hidden him gave him a small bundle of food and clothing. They wept as they sent him away, knowing their own lives would now be consumed by the chaos of war's end. He thanked them with a voice hoarse from too many months of whispers. Then he walked away, a child alone in a landscape of ashes. His first instinct was to return home. Perhaps his father had survived. Perhaps his siblings had hidden or been spared. He trudged back to his town, step after weary step, driven by fragile hope. But when he arrived, it was gone. Streets hollow, houses looted, synagogues reduced to rubble. He found no familiar faces, no laughter, no trace of the life he once knew. His homecoming was into emptiness. Grief became his companion. He was not the only one. Across Europe, displaced persons wandered roads, searching for families who no longer existed. Camps for survivors were set up, but even there, despair hung heavy. The boy felt older than his years, though he was still barely in his teens. He carried Auschwitz within him, the smell of the chimneys, the sound of dogs, the last look in his mother's eyes. Yet within that grief, something hardened. He remembered his father's words before the deportation. No matter what they do, you must live. Survival had been the first act of defiance. But now he began to ask, what was the second? What was the purpose of life reclaimed from death? Education became his refuge. With the help of aid organizations, he was placed in a school for orphans. At first, the lessons seemed distant, meaningless compared to what he had endured. Mathematics could not explain the cruelty of Auschwitz. Literature could not erase the memory of the crematoria. But slowly, he discovered that learning was not just about knowledge. It was about rebuilding. Each page of a book was a brick in the foundation of a new life, one that the Nazis had tried to deny him. He excelled. Teachers noticed his sharp mind, his relentless discipline. Yet beneath it all, there was anger, a burning sense of injustice. He had seen murder committed in broad daylight, cruelty disguised as law, authority twisted into oppression. He knew, even as a boy, that the world needed something stronger than revenge. It needed justice. By the time he reached adulthood, he had chosen his path. He would study law. He would not allow his past to turn him into a victim forever. Instead, he would wield the law like a shield, ensuring that others could never again be stripped of their humanity so easily. Becoming a judge was not simple. It demanded years of study, endless patience, and the ability to balance compassion with duty. But the boy who had once memorized guard patrols and shadows on barbed wire now applied the same discipline to understanding statutes, precedents, and the intricate machinery of justice. He rose, step by step, until one day he donned the robes of a judge. Imagine that moment. The child once hunted like an animal now sat on a bench of authority, presiding over the fate of others. The courtroom was his new battleground, not with rifles and fences, but with words and evidence. Each verdict carried the weight of his past. He was not just interpreting the law, he was living proof of why justice mattered. Yet even as he succeeded, the past never loosened its grip. At night, he still saw the chimneys, still heard the barking dogs. He could not erase the faces of those who had not survived. And so, he carried them with him into every case, every judgment. For him, the courtroom was not merely a place of procedure. It was a place where he could honor the dead by protecting the living. In time, his story became known. To students, he spoke of the dangers of silence, of how ordinary people allowed extraordinary evil to flourish. To colleagues, he reminded them that the law must always serve humanity, not destroy it. And to himself, he whispered the same vow he had made as a boy in Auschwitz. Never again, but survival carried a paradox. He had lived, yet so many had not. The guilt of that truth never left him. He wrestled with it for decades, questioning why he had been spared when his mother, his father, his siblings had perished. The answer never came. Instead, he turned guilt into purpose, ensuring that their absence gave weight to his every action. Toward the end of his career, he often returned to the camps, this time not as a prisoner, but as a witness. He stood before the ruins of Auschwitz, now a memorial, and placed his hand on the cold brick walls. He told the stories of those who had been silenced, his voice steady, his eyes unflinching. He spoke not just as a survivor, but as a judge, demanding the world remember that law without morality is nothing but tyranny. His life had been torn apart, but he rebuilt it not with vengeance but with justice. And in that transformation, he became more than a survivor. He became a guardian of memory, a protector of law, and a reminder that even from the ashes of Auschwitz, humanity could rise again. The boy who escaped Auschwitz had lived to see justice served, not only in his courtroom, but in his very existence. He was proof that survival was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of a duty to speak, to judge, to remember. And now, dear viewers, his story belongs to you. What would you have done faced with such choices? Could you carry the weight of survival, the burden of memory, and still dedicate your life to justice? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you believe stories like his must never be forgotten, subscribe now. Because memory is our weapon against silence, and silence is what allows history to repeat.